Every robbery you have ever heard of ends the same way, with fear. A weapon, a demand, a victim handing over everything they own and counting themselves lucky simply to be left standing in the road. This is the story of the one robbery that ended instead with music. On a cold, moon-washed heath on the very edge of London, a masked young Frenchman relieved a nobleman's coach of its gold. And then, before he melted back into the dark, he swung down from his horse, removed his hat, bowed low, and asked the lady inside if she would do him the honor of a dance. This is the legend of Claude Duval, the most charming thief who ever lived. And by the time we are finished, I am going to ask you to decide what it was he was really stealing. To make sense of a man like that, you first have to stand for a moment in the world that made him. It is the 1660s. Charles II is newly back on his throne, and London is a city drunk on its own reopening. Theatres lit again, coffee houses humming, the court a blaze of silk and scandal after years of grey Puritan quiet. But step a single mile beyond the last lamplit street and the glitter runs out fast. The roads out of the capital were dark, rutted and genuinely dangerous, threading across wide-open heaths, Hounslow, Hampstead, Bagshot, where the trees thinned and the only witness was the moon. Ask anyone who had to make that journey after dusk, and they would tell you the very same thing. The stretch of open ground at the edge of the city was a place you crossed quickly, with your hand near your purse and your heart somewhere up in your mouth, praying that the darkness ahead of you stayed empty. And here is the piece the films never bother to explain. Those roads were a robber's paradise for one very practical, very unglamorous reason: money. In 1670, there were no banks as we would understand them, no checks, no notes you could fold into a pocket. There was no branch in one town and a branch in another, between which your fortune might quietly travel as ink on paper. If you were wealthy and you needed to move that wealth, you moved it the only way there was, as gold and heavy coin in a strongbox under the seat of a lurching coach out across those lonely heaths. Every carriage that rolled out of London was, in effect, a small moving bank with no walls and no guards, and there was no shortage of men willing to go and rob it. The long civil wars had recently torn the country apart and then stitched it roughly back together again, and they had left behind a whole restless generation of former soldiers and ruined royalists, men trained to ride hard and to handle a weapon, who had come home to find there was no place left for them in the new order of things. Some of those men looked at the gold rolling out across the heaths every night, and then at their own empty hands, and quietly did the arithmetic. All a man needed to make his fortune was a fast horse, a pair of pistols, and enough nerve to say two words in the dark: stand and deliver. And of all the men who ever said those words, none said them quite like Claude Duval. He was not English at all. He was born around 1643 in Domfront, a small town in Normandy, into a family that had, depending on which whisper you believe, either fallen from minor nobility into poverty or never quite been noble to begin with. Either way, the important fact is this: young Claude grew up with expensive tastes and empty pockets. A boy who could see the world of gentlemen through a window he was never allowed to walk through. He went into service in Paris, learned the manners and the graces of his betters, and then, when Charles II sailed home to England in 1660 and the exiled royalists came streaming back with him, Claude came too, as a footman in the household of a great lord, most likely the Duke of Richmond. For a while, he lived inside the very world he had always watched from outside, and then it fell apart over a rumour that he had grown a shade too close to the Duke's own bride-to-be. Dismissed and penniless all over again, Claude Duval faced the oldest question a clever, proud, broke young man has ever faced. What now? And here is where I find him genuinely fascinating, because most men in his position, angry and desperate, would have reached for the threat, the raised fist, the fear that gets a purse handed over fastest. Duval reached for the exact opposite. He had no money, but he had every ounce of the charm and polish of the court. So he chose, in effect, to become the gentleman he could never afford to be, and to turn every robbery he committed into a performance. And I think there was something far deeper than mere cleverness in that choice. For a man born on the wrong side of the glass, locked out of the gentry by his birth and by his empty purse both, the dark road became the one and only stage on which he could finally be the gentleman the world had told him he could never be. Every bow, every courtesy, every softly chosen word was a small and private act of revenge against a society that had shut its doors politely in his face. It worked far better than it had any right to. Duval took to the heaths around Holloway and Highgate and Islington in fine clothes and finer manners, and he built himself a reputation unlike any other man on the road. He never, if the old accounts are to be trusted, raised a hand in violence. He was courteous, he was witty, he apologized charmingly for the great inconvenience of robbing you. There is a story of him stopping a certain Squire Roper, the man in charge of the king's own hunting hounds no less, relieving him of 50 gold guineas, and then, almost playfully, tying the poor fellow to a tree and leaving him for his servants to discover. 50 guineas. And the guinea was itself a brand new thing in those years, a gold coin freshly struck for a kingdom growing fat on overseas trade. 50 of them added up to several years of an ordinary man's wages, gone in a single laughing minute at the side of a country road. He became, in the imagination of the public, something entirely new. Not a thug of the roads, but a rogue of style, a bandit you might almost feel flattered to be robbed by. And in a city that adored a good performance above almost anything, word of the dashing French highwayman spread like spilled wine across a table. The wealthy travellers he preyed upon began, absurdly, to retell the tale as though it had been an honour. He was becoming famous, which, for a wanted criminal, is a very beautiful and a very dangerous thing to be. And here is where I'll come clean with you, because I have a suspicion I cannot quite shake. I think that we, sitting comfortably 3.5 centuries later, have been quietly robbed by Claude Duval just as surely as anyone he ever stopped on a heath, charmed into adoring a man who was, once you peel away all that lace and legend, still emptying other people's pockets on a dark road at the wrong end of a pistol. If you're with me on that, if the charm changes nothing and a thief is simply a thief, then let a like do the talking for you. But if you think there really was something different about this one, something the ordinary brutes of the road never had, then make his case for me down in the comments. Go on. I am genuinely open to being talked round, because his most famous night is coming, and it is the reason we still say his name at all. Picture it. A coach making its slow way across a moonlit heath outside London, late, the horses tired, a knight and his lady seated inside with, and this detail matters enormously, £400 in cash aboard, a small fortune, years upon years of a working man's wages boxed up beneath them. Out of the darkness ride Duval and his men, and the coach shudders to a halt. The lady inside, though, is no fainting flower. To show these robbers that she is not the least bit afraid of them, she takes out a small flute, a flageolet, and, cool as spring water, begins to play into the night air. And Duval, utterly delighted, does the one thing no other highwayman in all of England would ever have dreamed of doing. He produces a flute of his own, plays a few answering bars back to her, rides up to the carriage window, and says to the terrified husband, in effect, "Sir, your lady plays beautifully, and I would wager she dances every bit as well. Would you permit me the honour of a single dance with her here upon the heath?" The husband, outnumbered, outcharmed, and frankly out of options, agrees. And so Claude Duval swings down from his horse, hands the lady out onto the cold grass, as gently as if they were arriving at a ball at Whitehall, and there, beneath the open sky, with her husband looking on helplessly from the coach, and the moon hung up above them for a chandelier, the thief and the noblewoman dance a slow, formal coranto in the middle of absolute nowhere. There was no crowd. There was no music at all, but the memory of her little flute and whatever low tune he hummed beneath his breath. Just two figures turning slowly together on the wet grass, in the cold and the pale light, in a moment so absurd and so unexpectedly lovely that it would refuse, ever afterwards, to be forgotten. The old accounts swear that the finest dancing masters in London could not have matched his footwork out there in his great French riding boots. And when the music at last stopped and he had handed her, breathless, back up into her seat, Duval turned to her husband with a smile and pointed out, ever so politely, that he had quite forgotten to pay the musician. He took £100. He left the other 300 untouched, and he rode away into the dark, leaving behind him not a shaken, robbed victim, but a story that would outlive every single soul in that carriage by well over 300 years. And that, right there, is the genius of the man, and the deeply uncomfortable question buried underneath the whole shining legend. Because Claude Duval was plainly not just after the money. Any common footpad could have simply taken all £400 and left that couple frightened in a ditch. Duval took less, and took something else entirely instead. He took the admiration. He took the lady's flushed cheeks and the husband's helpless, grudging awe. He walked away with the story itself, and he made very certain it was a story in which he was not the villain at all, but the star. He turned his own victims into his audience, and in the case of the women, very often into something close to devoted admirers. That is a far rarer kind of theft than emptying a strongbox, and a far more powerful one. He was not only lifting purses out there on those heaths, he was, quite deliberately, stealing hearts. Here is the thing that keeps nagging at me, though, and I want to hand it straight to you. Almost everything we think we know about that dance, the flute, the coranto, the perfect little closing line about the musician, comes down to us from a cheeky pamphlet that was rushed into print within weeks of Duval's own end, half loving tribute and half tall tale. It was written, of all people, by a respectable astronomer named Walter Pope, and it sold because a good outlaw always sold. There was already real money to be made in printing up the lives of glamorous criminals, and Duval's was one of the very first and one of the very best of them. The legend was, in part, a product, and we have been happily buying it ever since. So, was it real? Or was it simply the 17th century's version of a story too good to check, the original piece of viral myth-making, printed precisely because people wanted it to be true? I honestly go back and forth on it. Tell me which way you lean, down in the comments. And if you have ever caught yourself loving a story exactly because you hoped, quietly, that it really happened, I would love to hear about that one too. Whatever the truth of the dance, the fame it earned him was very real indeed, and fame is the one thing a highwayman can never afford. By the autumn of 1669, Claude Duval had climbed to the very top of a list no man alive wants to top. A royal proclamation went out with his name at the head of the whole kingdom's most wanted offenders, and a reward, £20, a full year's wages for a labouring man, placed squarely upon his head. He was, in the plain words of the day, the most wanted highwayman in England. It got too hot for him. He slipped across the Channel, back to France, to let the heat die down, only to discover, to his considerable irritation, that robbery paid far worse over there, where the coaches carried less money and travelled with a great deal more protection. So he came back. He came back to the one city that truly loved him and to the roads that had made his name. And it was in London, not out in the dark of some heath, but in the warm, careless blur of a tavern called the Hole in the Wall in Covent Garden, that his luck finally ran dry. They took him drunk. Brought before Judge Sir William Morton, he was found guilty on 6 counts of robbery, with a good many more strongly suspected but never quite proven. And the sentence, in that age, for a highwayman of his particular fame, was never really in any doubt at all. But then something happened that tells you just how deeply this Frenchman had wound his way into the heart of Restoration England. As Duval sat waiting in his cell, a campaign began to save his life, and it was led by women. Not fellow criminals, not accomplices, but ladies of quality, women of rank and real fortune, who came forward to plead for him. Some of them, the story goes, arrived in masks to protect their good names, slipping through the streets to beg for mercy for a man who had, in more than a few cases, quite literally robbed them or robbed their friends. And the pleas went all the way up to King Charles II himself. And here is perhaps the strangest part of the whole affair. Duval appears to have genuinely believed, right to the very end, that his charm would rescue him one final time, that the adoring ladies and the merry, easygoing king simply would not in the end allow a man so beloved to come to harm. For a moment, it even looked possible. Charles was no cruel king, and he had a famous soft spot for a likable rogue. But the pressure ran the other way as well, from a judge quite determined to make a hard example of him, from a growing sense in high places that the joke had now been allowed to run quite far enough. The king refused a free pardon, and with that single refusal, the music finally stopped. On the 21st of January, 1670, Claude Duval was taken to Tyburn. He was just 27 years old. He met his end, by every account we have, exactly as he had lived his life, composed, elegant, entirely unafraid, with a written tribute to the ladies of England still folded up in his pocket. And then the man who had spent his whole career turning robbery into theatre gave the city one last, extraordinary performance. Except this time, he was not even alive to direct it. His body was carried to a tavern in St. Giles and laid out there in state, in a room hung floor to ceiling in black cloth and lit by a whole forest of candles, watched over by mourners in dark cloaks as though he had been some fallen prince. And London came. It came in such vast weeping numbers, so many grieving admirers pressing in to look upon him one last time, that a magistrate was finally forced to send an order to break up the crowd and clear the room. His admirers paid, out of their own purses, for a grand funeral, and Claude Duval, a French miller's boy, a dismissed footman, a wanted thief of the roads, was laid to rest beneath a slab of white marble in the centre aisle of one of the most fashionable churches in London, St. Paul's in Covent Garden. Mourned at the very last, as though half the city had lost someone it had loved. And on that white stone they carved him an epitaph that has, fittingly, outlived the stone itself. It carries a mischievous, knowing wit to it that Duval himself would surely have adored. It warned every reader who paused beside it that if he happened to be a man, he had best look sharply to his purse, and if she happened to be a woman, she had best look instead to her heart. For here, it said, lay the man who had made havoc of them both, the second great conqueror of the Norman race, to whom knights had yielded up their weapons and ladies had yielded up their affections. He was, the stone declared, the lady's joy, and, in the same breath, the lady's grief. I have stood in that very church on a quiet grey afternoon, and it is a strange and genuinely moving thing to picture him lying down there beneath the flagstones, this charming, restless ghost of the king's highways. The legend never truly let go of him. Nearly 2 centuries after his end, a celebrated Victorian painter would fill an entire canvas with that famous dance upon the Heath. His long shadow falls across every dashing gentleman rogue we have swooned over ever since. We still know the words his kind made famous, even now, that theatrical command to stand and deliver, half threat and half invitation, which is about as close as Robbery on the open road has ever managed to come to good manners. And the roads he once haunted lie quiet and safe now. The strong boxes long gone, our fortunes moved these days as silent, invisible numbers that no masked man on a lonely heath could ever hope to reach. But the story of the thief who bowed and asked a lady for a dance simply refuses to fade away. That is the tale of the highwayman who danced. If you would have me dig up more forgotten lives like his, the subscribe button is how the next one finds its way to you. And I would honestly love to know, down in the comments, faced with Claude Duval on a dark road on a colder night than this, which would you have surrendered the more easily, your purse or your heart? Do take good care of both, because in the end, the most dangerous thief is never the one who points a weapon at your throat. It is the one who bows and smiles and asks you so very kindly to dance.